What's up? Welcome back. In this episode, you'll get a deep dive into all of the fundamentals for building a very basic blog application. This is like the bread and butter of Rails. This is like one of the first demos that DHH ever did, was to create a blog application super fast. We're going to actually do it super slow. So we're going to go through in excruciating detail, not excruciating, it should be nice. I hope it feels good. It's not supposed to be excruciating. We're going to go into some detail talking about how you would set up just a very simple controller and model to add posts to a Rails application. So we're going to start from scratch. In this episode, we're going to build just the posts and the controller actions for those, how the routes work, talk about the models, a little bit of model validation. And then in the next episode, we'll go through the process of building custom authentication, talking through all of the pieces of how someone might put in a user or password and then authenticate. So let's start with a brand new Rails app. So we're going to say Rails new blog here, and we'll say -t, and we'll say database is PostgreSQL. Okay, when you start a brand new Rails application, you're sort of building from a template. So I'm using Rails 6.1.4. That is the latest as of today. And it's going to install a bunch of gems, which are libraries that we're going to use that have some, they come with a bunch of logic that we can depend on. So what we're going to start with today is we're going to use Rails scaffold. So we're going to say Rails G scaffold, and we're going to scaffold out a blog post application. All right, we're going to change directory into blog. All right, so Rails is fully installed. The next step we need to do is create the database. So I can say Rails db:create and hit enter. This is going to run the create command that will create the database for both development and test. So we just created two databases. One of them is called blog_development. The other is called blog_test. And when we create models and migrations, those migrations will run as SQL commands on those databases to create tables or update tables, add and remove columns, etc., so that we have some structure to work with. So what we can do with Rails is we can say Rails G scaffold and post. So we're gonna tell it that we want to Rails generate a scaffold. And the thing that we're scaffolding, the object in this case, or the class in this case, is called a post. And our post is going to have a few different attributes. It's going to have a title and a description. So we can say title. And by default, if we give it any columns, if we don't specify the type of the column, then it's going to use, I think it's just going to be like, like a short input text or a varchar 255 or something like that in the database. So it's basically just a string value. And for the description, we actually want to have maybe like a text field that's going to contain potentially more than 255 characters. So we want to say :text. This is how we can specify the type of column that we want. And by doing this, just by running Rails G scaffold post title and description, it is going to create a migration which will run the SQL commands to add a new table to the database. So this is the new migration. It's going to add the SQL commands to create the new table in the database with title and description. It's also creating a new model. And this model will be a class that represents instances of posts or relates directly to sort of the rows in that table. So an instance of a post will have a title and it'll also have a description. And there's a bunch of handy methods on these models, on active record models, that allow you to like find all the posts or delete a post or add a post. It will also create these routes. So it's going to define a bunch of routes for us. And routes are sort of the paths in the URL that map directly to functions that we're going to write inside of our Ruby code, so that when we go to a certain URL, a specific function is called and some HTML is returned. And those functions are defined inside of the controller. So we have a posts controller. And inside of the post controller, when we use scaffold, it actually builds out all the default 7 controller actions for us: index, show, new, create, update, edit, and destroy. Those are all the 7 actions that it will create for us. Scaffold will also create all of the different HTML files for us. And inside of these HTML files, we'll see that these views are going to use a little bit of embedded Ruby. That's why these are called .erb. .html.erb is we're going to have some HTML files where we're writing just a little bit of Ruby code in there to generate the HTML. We're also going to get a helper. I almost never use these helpers, but they're modules that allow you to write methods that work inside of these views, inside of the HTML.erb. It's also creating these JBuilders. So a JBuilder is a tool for writing Ruby code that spits out JSON. So we'll take a look at that in just a moment. Finally, it also is going to create some SCSS files for us so that we can style those posts. So let's take a look at what this might look like. So we can actually just say Rails server or Rails S for short. And this is going to fire up the server. This is going to start a server, which is now going to listen on port 3000. So we have a server running on localhost port 3000. I can actually just command click on that inside of my terminal. And we see, oh, when we open the page, we see that we have a pending migration error. So that means that we need to run our migration. So let's go back to the terminal, Rails DB migrate. We have to run Rails DB migrate to actually execute those SQL commands that were created by our migration file. When we're executing those SQL commands, things are going to change inside of the database. In this case, we're creating a table. So it wants to make sure that we don't have any pending migrations that have not run and have not modified the database before we can actually load our server. So we're going to say Rails S again. We're going to restart the server here. And we can click on this again. We're brought back to the browser and it says, yay, you're on Rails. So cool. But we don't see anything about our posts. And that's because these are going to be at the /posts path. So I can go to /posts, and this is going to be the index route, or the route at which I should receive the list of posts back from Rails. And you'll see it's already got like a little bit of HTML here. It's got a view for us. This stuff up in the top left is only available in development, and it's kind of just giving us a little bit of sort of debug mode tooling. You can kind of see some of the stuff about the request and drill into it. Usually, this might be helpful if you're trying to debug some performance things, but what's really cool is that we can click on New Post, and we've already got an input form for a title. We've already got an input form for a description. So let's just say this is going to be a test post, and we can click on Create Post. That will create a brand new post, and you'll notice that we were redirected to posts/1. So this is the show page for a post, where we can see the title and description. Probably not exactly the way we would lay out an actual blog, but it gives us the data, and then we can go kind of modify the view and play around with it. So now if we go back, we have buttons here for, so this is the index view again, where we see the list of posts. And we now see links next to, in this row for this post. We can go to the show page for the post. We can edit the post. So if we wanted to say like, okay, this is, edit, added new content, and we say update the post. Now we have this new content inside of the post. We can go back to our index route, and we can also destroy the post. So we can just delete the post. And we get this little pop-up that says, are you sure? Yes. And at the top, we see a notice that says the post was successfully destroyed. Let's go back to new post. If we wanted to create a post right now without a title or description, we could just click on create post. That'll create the post. So by default, there's no validations, but we do get a pretty rough structure for what we would want inside of a really basic blog application. Another thing that's really interesting, let's say that we want to say like, let's go back to actually like the posts index. We're going to say we want to create a new post. This is our latest post, and we'll say create post. Now on the show page, we can see /post/3. Now by default, we're getting back, because our browser is requesting HTML, the server is sending back HTML. So if we look here in the server logs, we see that we received a request for /post/3. That is the same route here, /post/3. And down here below, we see that we processed this request with the posts controller's show method. That's the show action inside the post controller as HTML. Okay, so what that means is that inside of the post controller, it's going to use the HTML views for that show route in order to render back the HTML that's coming back in the browser. So if we look at this page here and we say inspect, and we open up our network tab, and let me make this a little bigger. So 3 here is actually the request that's going for posts. So in the Chrome developer tools, so you can, sorry, I did it a little fast. If I right click and go to inspect, and then go to the network tab inside of these Chrome developer tools, you can see all of the different network requests that are going to fire from the browser to the server. So we can refresh the page here, and we'll see all of those requests head out. And we see one at the top. This is for /posts. There was like a request to pull in some CSS, some JavaScript, some more JavaScript, an ICO file for this little the little earth thing that's happening up there. We've got some more CSS and JavaScript, and then we actually do see some results here. So if we look at this request for /3 and we go to the response, this is the HTML that is being rendered by Rails back to the browser, and the browser is interpreting that HTML and showing us what's on the screen. Super cool. Now, another thing that you can do with Rails and when using scaffold is you can actually append another format to this URL. So we can actually say .json here and hit enter, and we will get back the JSON data for the post. So it's a little tricky to see. I don't have like a Chrome extension to make this pretty looking, but we see that the ID of the post is 3, that the title of the post is this is our latest, and the description says post. We also get created at, updated at, and a URL property for the post. So, or the URL property for the post. So this is actually, can be pretty handy if you're building like a mobile client that's in addition to your web client, but that is by passing in the format. Now, if we go back to our server log, here we see we started the request for /post/3.json. So that .json is going to be interpreted by the controller or by the middleware that's part of Rails, and it's going to pull off that JSON and say the format for this request is JSON. And so here we see that we're processing this request with the post controller's show method again, but now it's as JSON. So we're going to go look in the controller in just a bit and see how this works, but you'll notice that the difference is when we made a request for /post/3 without .json, the default was HTML, and we got back the rendered HTML, and it used these HTML.erb templates to render that back to us. Now that we're using JSON, we're seeing that the JSON.jbuilder templates were actually what was used, and that's what got spit back to us. So, all right, let's go take a look at how this all works. So we're going to change directory into blog again, and we're going to open up the app controller's posts controller. So actually, let's go to the routes first. Routes. So we're going to go to the routes. Resources posts. So just by saying resources posts, this is important that this is plural and this is also plural. There is another way that you can do this and say resource post, where resource is singular and post is singular. If you have objects inside of your database where there are really only one, or you're only working with one, this might be like your profile or your some sort of settings page or something. Or you only have one way to log in, so you might have resource session instead of sessions. Basically, if you do resource post, you will get all of the member routes, or you'll get routes that look like member routes for working with an individual object. When you say resources posts, you get the index route, and you get a number of other things that make it work with a collection of things. This is the most common. You're going to have resources comments and resources likes and resources users and resources whatever, just to build out all of your routes for your application. And so we've got resources posts. This is going to create 7 different mappings between routes, HTTP methods, and actions inside of controller. /info/routes. Okay. So like if you go to /rails/info/routes as part of your URL, you'll get this HTML page, which tells you all about the routes. Typically, you could also, or like in addition to this, you could also run Rails routes in the terminal, but the output is a little tricky to read. So what's nice here is you can see all of the different routes that are available to you. And these ones at the top were the ones that were created by resources posts. So we get the posts path. That's going to be a mapping between the GET request and /posts. And that is going to hit the index method or the index action inside of the posts controller. The posts path also works for a post request. So we can send a post request to /posts. Also, this is the HTTP verb, not like blog post. So this post is not blog post. We also can send a post to a mailbox or whatever, but like this post method here is not the same as a blog post. This is the post type of HTTP method or HTTP verb. And we can send a post request to /post. That's how we create a new post. And that maps to our posts controller's create action to create a new post. All right, let's keep going. We've also got the new post path. This is where we'll be able to create new posts. This is the route that will return the view with the form for creating a new post. We also have the edit route. So /post/:ID/edit. So why do we need that :ID inside of the path? Well, if you think about it, when we're trying to edit a post, we need to know which post we want to edit. In order to know which post we want to edit, we should pass along the ID that matches the row in the database for the specific post we want to edit. And so in this case, we're passing along that ID in part of the path for posts. And so we can go to like /post/1/edit. That'll edit the first post in the database. /1/3/edit. That'll edit the post in the database with ID 3. And by edit here, this is a little confusing when you're just starting out. So /edit, this edit post path receives a GET request to this path, and the server is going to return the form for editing the post. So this is not actually going to change the post. This path is not how you change the post. This is the path that's going to return the form that will allow you to, it's going to have the form fields that are like pre-populated with the post's data that allows you to edit that post. All right, next one, we've got /post/ID. That just shows you the specific blog post's page. And here we have patch and put. Okay, you'll notice here that both patch and put have the same path. They both go to the same path. They also go to the same controller action. So there's like sort of lots of arguments in the community about whether or not you should use patch or you should use put. So these are two different HTTP verbs. One of them, put, means that you're going to replace the entire remote resource. So you're going to like replace the entire post. You're updating and you're sending everything about the entire post, and you're completely replacing it with whatever you sent in. Patch means I am going to just change part of the post. So maybe you're just changing the title or you're just changing the description. So there's a lot of arguments about whether or not you should use patch versus put. And it turns out that in practice, it really doesn't matter whether you use patch or put, as long as you're actually like updating the thing correctly. And so both patch and put both map to /post/update. And so this is how you actually send a request with all of that data that you filled into the form. So when you hit submit, it's going to send all of that data back to the server, and the server is going to receive it, and it's going to say, okay, I know which post we're going to edit because that ID is in the path. And so we'll look up the post in the database. We'll take in those new parameters that were sent to us as part of that form submission, and we're going to update the post in the database so that it has new values. Finally, down here, we have a delete request to /post/ID. This is going to call the destroy action on the post controller, and that will just delete it from the database, plain and simple. Sometimes you'll implement your destroy action so that it actually just like marks, maybe it just updates a column in the database that says archive true, and then by default, you just won't return those posts because you may not want to like always delete all of the data from the database. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. There's ways you can implement this, but by default, usually you're just like deleting it from the database. So those are all the routes that are created for us by resources. Let's keep going. So back over here in /posts. Oh yeah, let's head back into our posts controller. Posts controller. Okay, so at the very top here, we see that the posts controller is inheriting from application controller. So the application controller is sort of like the overarching Ruby class that's going to give you the ability to write methods that apply for all of your application. You might, create another controller that inherits from application controller where you can write your logic for maybe an area of your app. So maybe you have a dashboard, or you have like a marketing app, or you have like your documentation page or your API controller. And those might apply different settings for what happens when you receive certain types of requests. It might do some sort of authentication or some other things, but for now, this is the default pattern. We're going to just inherit directly from application controller, and we'll go look at application controller later. Next, what we're saying is before any of these actions are called, so before index is called or show or new or edit, any of those routes are called. And again, these are the functions that are going to map directly to those paths and HTTP method combos. Before any of them are called, we are going to execute a method called setPost only on show, and then you can specify only on show, edit, update, and destroy. So this before action, there's a couple different ways you can write it. So you could write it just like this, where like you only put before action set post, then it will run before every single action. Or you can say before action and then only on these actions. So now what we're doing is we're saying before show, edit, update, or destroy. So before this route or update or destroy, we want to call set post. So set post is typically, or your before action is typically a method in the same controller. So let's go look at set post. So set post down here is saying find, we're calling post.find params ID. This params object is a Ruby object. It is its type is hash within different access. Doesn't really matter. It's basically a bag full of, or yeah, you can think of it sort of as a bag full of all the stuff that was passed to you in the request. It could be, there's going to be keys in here that are related to the keys that are mapped between the path, the dynamic parts of the path. There's also going to be the keys in here for the key value pairs that you send in the post request or in the query string parameter. So the params object in this case, when we say params ID, we are looking into this params object, which again is all the stuff that we were passed in the request in either the path, the query string, or the post body. And we're reaching into it with ID. In this case, :ID, this ID property is going to be set in the path. And recall back from our from the routes over here that this :ID was in the path. And that :ID is not ever going to be passed as just :ID in the route. We're going to pass 1 or 3 or 5. That's going to be the ID that maps to the row in the database, right? And so here what we're doing is we're saying post.find, and we're passing in the ID. So this is going to do essentially a select star from posts where ID equals whatever we passed in. So let's take a look at that. So if we come back over here and we go back to like posts/3, and we look at our, if we go back to the server log now, we can actually see this happening. So we see when we went to /post/3, that 3 mapped to :ID, and when we called set post, that post.find resulted in this query, in this SQL query. So we're seeing select posts.star or select star from posts where posts.id equals the first parameter, limit some other parameter. So, and then this is like the params that are being passed in. So we see that $1, that's going to be our the first argument. So we're saying like select star from posts where post ID equals 3, limit 1. So just give me back one of them. So that's what post.find is doing. And that is the result of set post. And we can actually see this super helpful little arrow that goes down and tells us this is on line 62 in the posts controller, and the method that it's calling is set post. So we'll head back over here, line 62 in the posts controller, and this post.find. So that's what's happening. And what's being returned from that SQL query is going to be some data that is going to hydrate or sort of like fill up or create an instance of a post object. So a post is a model. We'll go look at that class in actually right now. So let's look at the post.rb. Right now it is a model. It looks super simple. There's nothing in there. There's no right now we haven't defined any methods. We haven't defined anything inside of post. But because it inherits from application record, it is able to look at the database and understand things about itself. It knows that because its class name is post, then by default its table name in the database is posts all underscore. And it knows that because it's inheriting from application record that it has those columns in the database, and then based on all the columns that are in the database, it can sort of use reflection, or it can sort of know that it has methods on it for the title and description, and also the ID and some other things for the timestamps, created at, updated at, etc. All right, so we're calling set post before any of our methods are called, and we're storing the result of that, which is going to be an instance of a post object, in the @post instance variable. All right, so that's what's happening with this before action here. So before we call a show, edit, update, or destroy, all of the things, if you think about it, that are about an individual single post. So before any of those happen, we're going to call set post. That way we have access to this instance variable called @post anywhere inside of this controller. Anywhere inside of any of these methods. All right, let's go to the next few lines down here. So the index route. So if we receive a request to /posts or /post.json, we are going to make another database query. Post.all is basically select star from posts, and then it'll hydrate an active record collection, which is a fancy, basically it's just like a supercharged sort of array or collection that gives you a bunch of other methods. And that collection is going to be stored here in this @posts instance variable. And we don't actually see any other logic inside of the index route, right? So Rails is using a lot of convention, and a lot of people would say that it's very magical. And when you learn a few of these different conventions, then you can become very, very productive. So inside of this index route, by default, if we don't specify anything about which views to render or which templates to render, we're not doing any sort of logic inside of here. So by default, it's going to render the view that matches the name. So in this case, index, we're going into the views directory, the posts directory, because this posts directory maps to the same name of the controller, posts, right? And it is going to use the index.html.erb template by default if nothing else changes. You'll also notice that there is index.json.jbuilder, and Rails is smart enough to know that if you receive a request that's JSON, give back the JSON. So if we look at this, let's actually go to /posts and hit enter. This is the HTML we're getting back. This is index.html.erb. And we can look in the server log here, and we'll see our database query selects star from posts, and that is rendering our index.html.erb template on line 15. That is just like all implicit. It just knows that it needs to do that. Now, if we say /posts.json, we get back the JSON, and it just knows that because we are passing this format JSON, then it should default to using JBuilder. Now, the database queries are all going to be exactly the same because that index action that it's mapping to is not changing. So it's going to, first it will, do select star from posts, and then it's going to render the index.json.jbuilder. Let's actually look at, so this is the index.html page that Scaffold created for us. At the very top here, we have a notice. This notice is going to spit out things that we just want to show maybe like one time, basically. It's kind of like a little reminder of what's happening. So for instance, if we come back over here to /posts and we hit destroy, and yes, we're sure, post was successfully destroyed. This bit up here, we can actually right-click and inspect and look at the HTML, and we can see that post was successfully destroyed is inside of the paragraph tag with ID notice. And if we go back to our index.html.erb, we have this paragraph tag with ID notice, and we're printing out the notice. So this is ERB syntax. This is embedded Ruby syntax. So we're spitting out notice. So this notice variable is just available to the view if anything has been passed as part of a notice. All right, next we've got a H1 with posts. It built out the entire table for us. And if we get down past the table head, we have the table body here. So it's actually iterating over all the posts. Again, here we're encountering embedded Ruby. This time, notice that we don't have an equal sign. So this one had an equal sign. This one does not have an equal sign. The difference is that when we want to actually spit stuff out into the HTML, we're going to use the equal sign. When we want to do logic for looping or conditionals, we are not going to have the equal sign. So here we are doing some logic. We're not actually spitting anything out on this line specifically. Instead, we are looping over each of the posts. So recall that @posts was an instance variable that was set in the posts controller's index action, and that is going to be all the posts. And so we're saying go over each of the posts and pass each post into this block. And so when this block executes, we'll have access to an instance of the post. Here we are using the equal sign, and we're saying, okay, at this point, we want to actually spit some stuff out into the HTML. And so we're taking post.title for the post, and we're printing that out into the table data at that point. Same thing for the description. On this third table data, we do something a little different. We're using a link to. So link to is a Ruby method. It's a Ruby view helper. It's a helper method that is going to take in a couple different arguments and return some HTML as a string, and that will be rendered back as the value that's entered into the HTML that we're returning from the server. So for the next three, we're creating links. One is a link to show, edit, and destroy. Destroy is a little bit fancy here. We're actually specifying the method, and we're passing in some other stuff here. So we've got a confirm call. Confirm is, remember when we destroyed that one post, we got the little pop-up that said, are you sure you want to destroy this? And we were able to say yes, and that actually destroyed it. So we've got destroy, and yeah, so this is the HTML that's being rendered back for that index route. Let's take a look at the show route. The show route doesn't actually have any logic inside of it, right? We're not doing anything inside of here. There's no render this, render that. There's no instance variables or anything. That's because this show route is depending on this set post being called so that it can use that at post instance variable we talked about before. So this is running, and that instance variable is going to be used inside of the implicit template that's returned. So show.html.erb. So this is going to be the HTML version. This is going to be the JSON version. Again, we have a notice. We've got the title. This time we're using the, we're spitting it out. We're using the equal sign to print it out. And we're using at post. So that's a little different from the index, right? So here we used at posts plural because that's a collection of posts. But then inside of the block, post here is not an instance variable. It's just like a local variable that's local to this block that's available inside of the template. So now we can just use ERB to print out the attributes of that instance of post. But inside of show, hopefully I'm not confusing it here. Inside of show, we're using at post directly because the show page, again, is working for an individual post, not a collection of posts. Let's keep going. So the next action here is new. We are creating a new instance of a post that is going to be an empty post. And we'll talk about the purpose of that in just a moment. Edit. Same thing as show. It's just going to send back this the edit page. And the edit page is actually very simple, and it has something another thing that's interesting that we can talk about. And that is that we are calling this render method inside of the template. And this render method is being used as part of, again, ERB, where we're going to like render out some HTML. And this is actually called a partial. So we're going to render the form partial, and we're going to pass it some data. So this is like saying like render a subcomponent of the HTML. So render just like a sliver of the HTML back and give it some data. And the data we want to give it is this post. And so when we render the form partial, we'll go look at that in a moment. It's going to receive as an argument this post variable that we can then use inside of the form partial. So this, inside of our views, down in views posts, we have underscore form.html.erb. This underscore that's in the front, this tells us that it is a partial. What's weird is that when you say render here, you don't actually say like render underscore form or anything. You just say render form, and it knows that you're rendering a partial and that partial's name is actually underscore form.html.erb. So if we look at form is saying we're going to create a form with, we're going to use the form with helper. And this time we are going to spit out, because it's going to spit out a form tag that wraps the entire, this entire view basically. And the model that it's using is post. And this post model, again, was the argument that was passed in to the partial. So post here, this post is going to define that local variable that refers back to the instance variable at post. Okay. Inside of the form partial, we actually have a whole bunch of logic here for creating these fields, displaying a bunch of error messages. We'll talk about this in more depth later. I actually don't use these form helper methods like form with and form.label, form.textfield, because it is challenging to migrate from a form that's built with form with to another framework. If you're going to switch to a client-side framework like React or Angular or Svelte or Vue or Ember or Back, like any of these front-end frameworks, you're probably going to want to work with just bare HTML. And so I usually write all of my forms with just raw HTML. There's a couple other things this gives you. One is called an authenticity token, and that's to prevent cross-site request forgery or the ability for someone to send a post request from a completely different server to your server to like create something. So that this form with helper is going to give you a lot of stuff. We're going to talk about that in later. We'll talk about that later. Okay, back to our post controller. That is our new and edit actions. They're both going to use that form partial. One of them is going to pass in an existing post. One of them is going to pass in a new post. So when you see the new page, all of the fields are empty, but there is values in there. The values are just empty values for this blank post, basically. So post.new is creating a new instance of a post that is just empty. It's not stored in the database. When we say .new, that just creates a new instance in memory. It doesn't actually persist it to the database. But what does persist it to the database is the create action. So this one is a little bit more involved. Let's talk about how this works. First, we're going to call post.new, and we're going to pass in post params as our argument. So where does this post params thing come from, and how does this work, and what's actually happening right here? Well, we're calling post.new, which does not actually persist the post to the database, and we're passing in post params. And post params is going to be another method that we write in this same controller by convention, and that's down here at the very bottom, post params. And here we're saying params.require post.permit title and description. So again, we're talking about params. Remember that we talked about params earlier, how that's sort of a bag of all the things that you receive in the request. One of those things is going to be any of the dynamic arguments that are part of the path or the query string or the body, whatever. So this is going to be where we deconstruct the params that we received in the post request. And we say, okay, we must receive in the post request or the put request or patch request, we must receive an argument where at the top level, there is the key post. So we must receive at the top level the key post. So let's actually go and create another form. So we're going to say new post, title is testing is this thing on, and we're going to hit create post. When we hit create post, actually, let's inspect this too. So this is our form, the form action. So this is the form builder built all of this HTML for us, right? And notice that it has the authenticity token here. We'll come back to that. That's again for protecting against CSRF or cross-site request forgery. The action for this form tells it where to send the data. So we're sending a request to /posts, and the type of request we're sending is a post request. I'm realizing that blog post was a bad example because there's so many post. This post request is the HTTP verb, not the type of post. So this would be get, post, put, patch, delete, etc. So we are sending a post request to /posts, and the data that we're sending is going to be what is collected in these input forms. So the name value is what's important here. This name value defines what ends up in params in the controller. So when we click on create post, that's going to collect all the data from all these different inputs, and it's going to send it to our server. And when it sends it to our server, it's going to send it, and the values, so testing, the value testing is going to be nested under post, title, and the value is going to be testing. So there's going to be a top level sort of hash where we have the key post, and post is going to point at another hash, a nested hash, where the key is title, which points at a value, and the value is testing. So it's going to be something like this, where we're going to have post, and post is pointing at another hash where there's a key title, and title is pointing at our value testing. And it's going to have some other values too, because if we look at this field, we have the description. So post description. So this is going to be description, and that's going to point at this giant thing that I'm writing right now. Let's just say thing on. Is this thing on? Okay. And that's going to end just like that. So this is kind of the shape of the data that's going to come into Rails. And hopefully this makes sense. Yeah, so this is what we're going to receive as part of the post request. Now, when we're looking at the params and we say okay, what else is it going to require? It's also going to have maybe the action is going to be index or create, right? And it might also have controller posts controller or something like this, right? So it knows that it needs to go to the posts controller's create action because we are sending a request to /posts with a post HTTP method. When we say require post here, when we say params.require post, what that does is it looks at all the params and it says, you must have this post key. And when we say require, it actually just kind of strips other stuff out, sort of. So you can kind of think of it as doing this, basically. So that you only have title and description left. And here where we're saying permit title and description, we're saying that title and description are okay to set on the model that we're creating or updating. And the reason you might do this is consider the case where you have an order, right? And you want to allow the user to create a new order. And they're going to say, I'm buying a car. the ID for the car is F-150 and the value of the car is $50,000. And this is me submitting my order. Now in your database, if this is a very simple use case, right? If you're in your database, you were like, okay, I just have to look at the orders table. And then in the orders table, I'm going to look at the paid column. And if this person has paid for their order, I'm going to send them their goods. So if you were a hacker and you wanted to try to mark your order as paid, you might mess around just in the HTML here and right click and say, oh, I'm going to actually like edit as HTML. And I'm going to add my own input field that is going to be like type of, I don't know, text. And I'm going to say the name is order paid and the value is equal to true. And I'm just going to like, or maybe even make it like hidden. And that's it. Now there's like a hidden field. So when I submit this form, which we'll do right now, right? And we look at the server log, we received a post request here. So we received a post request to /posts, and we got the authenticity token, we got our post, and we also got order paid. So like anyone can just right click, inspect, edit the HTML that's on the page and send whatever the heck they want in. And that is why we need this permit thing, because anyone can just edit the page and say they can pass whatever they want. And if we were saying params.require order.permit, title, order ID, and paid, then anyone could just go in there and mess around and pass in whatever values they want and sort of like decide that they have paid, even though they might not have actually paid for this F-150, and they would receive the goods, which might be kind of nice. But permit here, this whole deal with params.require post.permit title description, this is called strong params. I think it was added in like 2013, 14, 15-ish. Before we had strong params, you had to manually go to the model, which was like really far away from the controller, and set up a bunch of permissions allowing certain things to be set on the post or set on your models. So this brings it up into the controller, and the whole purpose here is so that so we only allow a list of trusted parameters through when we're creating or updating our data. Okay. Also worth mentioning, you might have different parameters for create and update. Like maybe you can create a post with a title and description, but you can't update the title. You can only update the description, in which case you would have different methods for post params in each case. All right, that was a long way to talk about this one line here. Okay, so we're going to create a brand new instance. Again, this does not persist it to the database. It just creates a new in-memory instance that has a title, it has a description, and that's it. Then we get to this block here where we're saying respond to do format. Now, respond to do is taking in a block, and that block is going to pass the format. This format value was passed in from localhost 3000 / Rails info routes. Yeah, so this, recall that this like colon format is here, right? So when we have parts of the path that are inside of parentheses, this means that it's optional. I can't remember all the computer science terms for this. It's like a, grammar, expression, something, but this means that it's optional. So you can optionally pass a format, and notice how format starts with a colon, similar to ID starting with a colon, and that format, notice also that the dot is before it. That's because when we say like /posts.json, the dot part is not part of the format. .json is not the format. The format is just JSON without the dot. So we can optionally put a dot and then the word of the format after it. Anyways, this format is going to be available here when we say respond to do format. And what format allows us to do is specify different responses based on whether we receive an HTML request or a JSON request or a turbo stream request or an XML request, CSV request. There's tons of other different formats that you might want to support. So that's what this block is doing. It's saying like, let's set up a block where we're going to either do something based on one type or another type of response. If you're building just a web application that doesn't have JSON, you might just ignore this entire line and just redirect to post or whatever, do the stuff that's inside here. If you, otherwise you might want both. You can do as many as you want to. All right, if at post.save. At post, recall at post is an instance of a new post. It has the title and description passed in from the post request, from the body. And we're calling .save. We are not calling .save exclamation point or .save bang here. .save is a method on active record base or these active record models that when we call it, it returns a Boolean value. So this tells us true or false. This just tells us, yes, we saved it in the database, or no, we did not save it in the database. And if we saved it in the database, this will return true, and then we'll do this block of work. If we did not save it in the database, it'll return false, and we'll do this block of work. So in the first block of work here, we're saying if the post was saved to the database because it is completely valid and it didn't fail any database constraints, there's no foreign key issues, and it passed all of our validations that we've written for the post. Like maybe we might want to add a validation that required that it had a title and that the title was longer than X and that the title was unique and that the title didn't have bad words and that the title had emojis. I don't know. Like you could write validations that checked all of those things. And if any of those validations failed, this would return false and we would come back over here and return some other stuff. Otherwise, if it successfully saves in the database and we receive the request as HTML, we are going to do this. We are going to redirect to at post. So redirect to is a way of telling it's a way to respond to the browser with a specific header and HTTP status code that tells the browser like, okay, got it. We were able to create the post. Thanks so much. Here's a new URL. Go request this new URL. And the URL is going to be /posts/ the ID of the new post. So this is actually saying like redirect to posts, a post path for at post.id, which is the same as like /posts/ plus like at post.id. But because it's so common that we want to redirect to like the show route for an instance of a thing, instead of having to write all of that, you can just write at post, and Rails will figure out like, okay, we're redirecting to this class. What class is it? Okay, it's a post class. Okay, what is the path for the post class? Then it's going to look up the controller and the routes and everything, and it'll figure out that it needs to go to /posts/ the ID of the post. This bit that's after this, notice that we're getting back to the notice. Recall that in the index.html.erb page, we had like that little render at the very top that had the notice. That's where we're going to spit out this content. So this is how we assign that notice variable that's going to be used when we make that request. This, the implementation of this under the hood, I don't actually know how it's implemented. It might be cookies or something, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a way to pass that notice variable to the view and redirecting. Okay, if we receive this post request for to create a new post as part of a JSON request, so maybe this was happening with an AJAX call, or we implemented this with an iOS app or something where we're going to like make a JSON call to create the post. We don't want HTML back if we're making the call from an iPhone app. So here we're going to render show. So we're going to render the show template for a post, which is going to be the JSON for that post. And the status code we're going to respond with is that created status code. And we are also going to pass along the location of the post. So if we wanted to, we could receive or retrieve the instance of the post. Now, if saving the post failed, we're going to re-render the view, the new view. And that new view, recall that new view is rendering the form partial. The form partial that's here. That new view, when we render that new view, we're going to also render status unprocessable entity, aka 422. This just means like, so there's an important piece here though. So let's go look at the new view real quick. The new view is rendering that form partial, just like the edit view. So the new view and the edit view are very similar. One of them has a link back. One of them has a link to the show for that instance of the post. The new view doesn't have a link to show because there is nothing to show for a post that hasn't been created yet. But notice that we are still passing in the post. Now, if you think about like why we would pass in the post for the new view, and that is because We want to make sure that if someone messes up their submission, we are able to repopulate and rehydrate those input fields with whatever they had filled in that was valid. So for instance, if we were validating that they put in a title and a description and that the title had emojis in it and they filled out the title and they spent hours writing their description, they hit submit, and we just responded with an empty form where the title and the description were empty and we said invalid title, they would be like, their head would just explode because they would be so frustrated that they had typed in this description. I'm sure you've experienced this, right? You go to some page, you're working on this, I don't know, peer evaluation or something, right? Or you spend a bunch of time filling in a form and then you go to submit and there's some tiny little thing that was invalid, like, oh, you accidentally mistyped your CVC for your credit card or something, and then it wiped out the entire form and you were just like raging because the data that you had saved that was completely unrelated to the form field that was invalid was also wiped out. So the whole reason that we passed that instance variable down from the new view is so that if this instance variable post had any valid data in it, which it would have when we created it, right? It would have had the description and the title. Those would go back into and fill in the input fields. So that's not going to like keep this post around between requests. This is all like, it's not persisting between requests as we're working through like fixing a post that was invalid, but it is going to just keep passing around the data so that your form stays, filled out basically. All right, long-winded, go down to update. Update is basically the same exact thing as create, except we already have an instance variable for the post, which was created by set post down below. We're calling update instead of calling save, and we're passing in post params. Again, that's going to do the strong params business where it ensures that there's a post there, so it's going to require post and then permit title and description. And then we're going to do something very similar here where we redirect to the post if it's successful, or we're going to render the edit view if it's unsuccessful. The one other thing we can talk about is the errors. So if we fail for either the create or the edit action, we're rendering back the JSON for the errors. Now, when you write active model validations, active record validations for your models, those are going to automatically create this errors object if it fails to save to the database. And you can get really nice, beautiful error messages from just like a couple of simple methods inside of your models. And we'll look at that later. So that is our update route. Let's go down to destroy. We're just calling post.destroy if it was, and that's it. We just call post.destroy, deletes it from the database, and we move on. If we got the request as HTML, we're going to redirect back to the list of all the posts, and we're going to add that notice that the post was destroyed. Otherwise, if we got the request with JSON, we're just going to render back and say, cool, sounds good. Nothing happened. So we're actually responding with just a header that has like no content. All right, that is the entire controller action. We talked about routes. We talked about the controller. We looked at all the views. This is what happens when you use Rails G scaffold. So I hope that is valuable. Let's actually break for the next episode. What we're going to do is implement our own authentication. So we're going to implement just username and password or email and password authentication with Rails from scratch, walking through every single step in the process. And so I hope you will join us for that next episode. Thank you so much for watching. I know this was super detailed. This was really intended for folks who are brand new to Ruby on Rails. So follow along in the next episode and we'll talk about a lot of the fundamentals for authentication and how those work. Thanks so much for watching and we'll see you next time.